So I want to begin by inviting our audience participants to use the chat function and to introduce yourself if you haven't already. Would love to hear whose country you're on and to hear a couple of words if you'd like to share them about any systemic issues that you're grappling with. So we've got quite a big audience. We're not anticipating we'll get through all of those, but really just to get a bit of a sense of what are the kinds of systems level challenges that people are grappling with or thinking about that's drawn you to this conversation today. While we're doing that, we're going to start hearing from our terrific panel. Now, we do have people's work bios available online, so rather than read through those here, I'm going to invite our panel to introduce themselves, telling us about their connection to country and about the systems change that they're working towards. And I'm going to start just by giving you that context for myself. So I was born and grew up on Gadigal land here in Sydney, and I'm really thrilled to be back living and working in this place. I think really my connection with thinking systemically and grappling with the issues that we're going to be talking about today really grew from student activism, where I was really passionately involved in a whole lot of issues that were really at their heart about justice, whether social justice or other ways that justice was experienced. And from uni, I fell into criminology, and there I found a really applied context for my interests in social justice. So working around overrepresentation of First Nations, of young people, particularly in terms of pathways into what was then juvenile justice, thinking about the overrepresentation of women in prisons. And from there, I've sort of moved into social policy and thinking about how some of those factors, those determinants in people's lives really shape experience. But always I've been interested in the intersections and how people can share and connect across very different experience. I think I've just always seen things systemically, and I've become really inspired around building collaborative responses to those kinds of systemic challenges. So in my work now, I pursue that by supporting partnership between the legal, health and social service systems, but also by bringing together the best of knowledge, of practical experience and of policy levers to try and ensure that our health and our human services best support the communities that they're here to help. So that's a bit of context and what brings me into this conversation today. And I'm going to invite our panellists now to introduce yourselves and, as I say, tell us a bit about where you're from and then about the systems change that you're working towards. And Geoffrey, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you, Tessa, and thanks, Mark and the Sydney Policy Lab for having me today. I, like the University of Sydney, am currently on Gadigal land, so I acknowledge elders and pay my respect. My father and my family are proud members of the Gamilaroi people from far north western New South Wales, Walgett in particular. So I'm sure many, or at least some of you, have had interactions with that really fantastic but often difficult community. And it's probably closely linked to that family background that I draw my origins or original inspiration towards systems change. I had, by background, a formal training as a lawyer and spent quite a few years as a lawyer. And in one way, what I do now is completely opposing to that, a system which is extremely rigid, in which you exist to reinforce those structures. And at Just Reinvest, obviously justice reinvestment is a concept we're hearing a lot more about at the moment, but I too, like Tessa, think of it as productive or constructive activism. It's not about being an abolitionist and trying to blow the place up, as it were, but to take systems that are clearly not working to achieve the outcomes we all collectively want to see, and to mold and amend and use many, many levers of change to produce those outcomes. I'm a quite simple person, so I particularly love thinking about systems change in the 6 conditions, which people I'm sure are familiar with. And the reason I love that framework is because as a lawyer, I constantly thought how limited the levers were for me in a courtroom or in advice to a client in terms of affecting a social change outcome. Whereas when I think about those 6 conditions, the relational, the explicit, the deep collaborations required, it just seems so much more liberating to achieve change because there are so many different elements you could reach for. I particularly really enjoy the relational aspect. Systems are reinforced by people. And I think here at Just Reinvest, particularly as we're starting to engage with some really deep thinking around what reinvestment might look like, it's those relational kind of levers that are becoming vital in terms of at least opening up a conversation about what that might be. So, for example, for us at the moment, one of the big conversations is that justice reinvestment isn't just about money, that in fact it's about shifting the decision-making power. And I think having those conversations, which are very confronting conversations, is enabled and made more productive when you think about change as being something that involves many, many levers, and one of them being the relationship. So that's me for now, but I also would like to just acknowledge that I see Paul and Mark here, who are on our executive committee, so I just want to call them out as well.
Thanks, Geoffrey. I really love that connection around relationships. And I think that's such a helpful way to come into a conversation about systems change, because I often think if you think about systems as these big, amorphous, unwieldy institutions or entities, it's really hard to think about change. But when you think about systems as the people within them, those are your levers for change. And I think there's something really strong in that foundation for this conversation today. Jane, would love to throw to you now and invite you to tell us a bit about yourself, your connection to country, and what brings you into this work at the systems level.
Thank you, Tessa. So I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and our future elders. I was actually born overseas. I was born in England and have lived in New Zealand for a long time in my childhood. So hello to the New Zealanders who have joined. But now I'm feeling very lucky to be on Wurundjeri country, although it's very cold today in Melbourne. My entry into systems thinking and systems leadership actually came from being a social entrepreneur first. And so I was fortunate to be able to create organizations, create social enterprises in order to tackle issues, and was, had an incredible time doing that for people, was very impactful. And then I started to win awards, and one of those was a Schwab Foundation Award to go to the World Economic Forum. And a group of us started to think about what might be the limitations of the work that we were doing and how, in fact, could we have greater impact. And so my journey around understanding systems was thinking about, well, actually, what are the root causes of the issues that I was trying to tackle with a program response or a social enterprise response. And as I was doing that, I started thinking about and exploring the issues that children in Australia are facing. And we've made incredible gains for children in Australia, but we still have a group of children who do experience developmental vulnerability at that start of school, and then that often carries on. Not always, but sometimes. So I started thinking about how do we shift that, and how do we help a system like, say, our early learning or early childhood education and care system, in fact, adapt to enable and support more children to do better developmentally. And so that's where I started to move into systems work. It's also, for me, systems thinking acknowledges that social issues are complex. A child experiencing developmental vulnerability will be because of a range of things. And it gives us a way of understanding how all of the factors that might affect a child might impact on their outcomes. So a bit like Geoffrey, one of the enormous things that systems thinking gives you is the ability to be in relationship and work collaboratively and collectively. And in many ways, that's the only way we can work within systems to change complex issues. So that was my journey into systems thinking and systems leadership.
Thanks so much, Jane. And I think one of the things that's really interesting for us to be opening up at the start of this conversation is why we need to work systemically. And we've heard from you that recognition of really it's about responding to complex issues. So interested to carry that forward into the conversation. But let me now throw to you, Belinda, to introduce yourself and your connection to this conversation.
Thanks, Tessa. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here with you all. I'll also start by acknowledging I'm meeting with you today on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and celebrate the fact that here in Queensland, where I am, we are advancing on the path to treaty and the process of truth-telling associated with that, and looking forward to, I guess, some of the transformation that brings for all of Queensland's communities as we go through that process. So I guess following on from what's been said, my background originally in teaching and social work, so strong sort of themes of social justice similar to those already talked about. But I guess probably in very straightforward terms, I've got a real kind of passion commitment to the value of organising and I guess the human effort of that, and see systems as just really, really large meta organisations or combinations of organisations interacting, sometimes intentionally and sometimes accidentally. And one of the things that really attracts me to systems thinking and working in terms of systems change is that idea of synthesis, of bringing various parts of those systems together, maybe in ways that are uncomfortable, or even sometimes across parts of the system that are repelling each other, but to be doing that for the benefit of sort of broader social change, and in particular to take away a singular focus on individuals as the source of all of their problems. Classic social work thing to say, I know, but systems thinking really helps us think about that broader context in a way that avoids blame and helps us to make, I guess, the social and economic circumstances of people better more broadly. So, my most, I guess, extraordinary experience of systems like that coming together was my time spent in the social impact investment space, bringing together, social purpose and social organisations, community organisations, social enterprises with the world of money. And, that space I often described in terms of mixing oil and water. I still think it's the case now. But I think if you can manage to do that, you can get real shifts in people's mindsets, ways of thinking and culture that make a long-term contribution to change. So yeah, that idea of synthesizing spaces across systems is attractive to me. Thanks, Tessa.
Thanks, everyone. So we've started to unpack a bit already in this conversation, the why of systems change. And I just wanted to come back to you all and see whether there's anything you want to add to that. We've heard a bit about that need to respond to complexity. We've heard a bit about shifting mindsets, and Belinda, that really generous approach that sees us moving away from blame. But I think there's also, then you can see that in some of the comments in the chat also, there's also recognising accountability, and I think we'll come to that, thinking about different players at different levels of the system. So we've got the sort of mindset and cultural elements. Anything else people want to put, and obviously the starting point around relationships, anything else in the why we need systemic approaches for the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve?
I'll have make one further comment. I think it was made already, but it can't be stressed enough, which is that if you look at the organisations represented in the attendees and the speakers, and all of the social issues they're trying to attack and resolve, you can't underscore enough how complicated and how deeply entrenched the problems are. So no one here works in the space when that is an easy fix. If it were, it would have been done. And I think the idea that there's not been a single lever or one or two that could be reached for to fix these problems points to why it has to be a systems change approach, because at all times you're reaching for 5 or 6 or 7, 8 different levers. It's not one option to fix the problem. I guess that's why I get excited about this approach, is because it's rather depressing. We do a lot of work with the Aboriginal Legal Service, and in a meeting yesterday, one of their senior lawyers was venting, as they need to, because it's a really frustrating system within which they work, venting about a problem. And I automatically heard myself starting to problem solve the problem in a way that was very different to how I would have approached the problem when I was a lawyer, because all of a sudden I work in a space where there is a far bigger variety of levers to reach for. And I think that is the exciting opportunity that makes these big problems not so confronting. They're still hugely challenging, but makes them exciting in a way because you can see how a combination of these elements could result in a really complicated, long, entrenched problem being fixed. That's certainly how we're thinking in a justice reinvestment space around incarceration, particularly in Aboriginal communities, which is obviously a long-standing blight on the country, one that has been run at many times with very different approaches. But I think the excitement we're feeling around the country, particularly with now governments at all levels getting on board with the concept, points to this idea that actually, yeah, there's an acknowledgement that you'll only solve these problems if you take the really complex and multidimensional approach that a systems change approach, gives you.
Thanks, Geoffrey. And let's stay with you then in this context about if we're getting really clear why we need a systems approach, we're also starting to really grapple with, well, what does it look like to lead in that space? So I'd love to come now right into the meaty question that we've put up for discussion today, which is, what does leadership look like within systems change? And Geoffrey, would love to hear from you first, particularly given that example of bringing quite a different lens depending on the context that you're in. What do you think it looks like?
So I think it looks like playing to your strengths and not having an ego in this, and being able to step back when there are others in your sphere and in your organization or in your partnerships that have other strengths. So for example, I noticed Margot Beach from the Dusseldorf Forums on the call, who has a lot of experience in partnerships and communities, all of these things that I probably don't. And we often reach out to these partners and bring them into a conversation because we recognize that I might have a strength in terms of understanding a particular policy or a practice, or perhaps even the flow of resources in terms of Treasury's allocation of, funding for a particular community work in. But understanding some of the power dynamics or the relationships and connections, or even the mental models, is the strength of somebody else in our network. And it's about reaching out, building that coalition. And Margot's always talking to me about, think about the partnership, and she's right. It's about using partnership as the model. So building a coalition of strengths, playing to those strengths, but as a leader, getting out of the way when it's somebody else that has that skill that's going to achieve the breakthrough.
Jane, Belinda, what do you think?
I'm happy to build on Geoffrey's comments, because I think it's really important. One of the things he's distinguishing is that difference between leading within a system and working and leading systemically. And often people say, well, I'm a systems leader. and it's true. You might be leading an organization or a particular interest in a system. Working systemically is the things that Geoffrey's talking about, understanding all those multiple perspectives around an issue, the experiences, the stories people share about that system. And I think critically bringing in the lived experience of the very people who experience and live the systems that we're talking about. That's quite different from leading an interest. Both valid, very important, but leading systemically does involve, I think, some skill sets around being curious and humble, and that ability to keep learning. Like Geoffrey, every time I talk to someone, I have a deeper appreciation of the very system, which is early learning for us, that I'm working in and around. And I think one of the things that's quite hard to hold in our system, and somebody raised it in the chat previously, most of the systems we all work in are market-based systems, or, early learning is a mixed market. It doesn't incentivize collaboration. It doesn't naturally create the spaces for collaboration and for solving problems together. And so, again, that underscores the importance of why systems work is really important. Some of the things we've been thinking about in our process of sort of leading in systems change is that process of inquiry and diagnosing and responding in partnerships and collaborations, being able to zoom in and out of situations to really understand what's going on. And I think one of the things I could not underscore enough, to lead systemically takes bravery, actually, and courage. Because sometimes you've got to call out, name the things that a system is really challenged by.
Belinda.
Yeah, I mean, building on that, Jane, and, in that, courage is vulnerability, right? Which is sort of sometimes in a leadership sense, maybe countercultural, this sort of idea that leaders have to be, strong and clear in direction. And at times, maybe in that sort of systems change piece, the leadership requirements are of vulnerability, being able to say, I don't know, I know, I'm not sure. But I wanted also to sort of build on the ideas of, I mentioned before around organisation, because I'm so fascinated by this sort of, people inhabit structures. They inhabit those structures, for better or for worse, sometimes because they're interested to see things improve, but sometimes because they want to maintain the status quo. And then also, people contribute to shape and drive culture, and those two things in combination are, I think, two of the biggest challenges of leadership inside systems work. So, how to continuously and incrementally shape and change structures and culture in a way for permanence, so that those things don't revert, they don't get dragged backwards by the status quo. And I think going back again to Jane's comments that, to lead in that sense is to put yourself probably in a fairly vulnerable place, particularly if you are really taking it to the status quo, because those sort of powers that sit around keeping things the same can be quite, challenging to confront, and maybe over time not really sympathetic, I guess, to your leadership. If you get my drift, I might be saying that too subtly, but yeah, I think those challenges of structure and culture are really central to the leadership piece.
If I might just riff off that to borrow a term from one of my colleagues, Joe Taylor mentioned in there, in the comments at least, funding systems, and that is a system which I suspect all of us exist in, because we're all funded in some way, whether we're inside government or outside, we don't escape that. And one of the challenges I've felt since stepping into this space is, all right, you've got an organisation, it's naturally got a boundary, you've got funding agreements, you've got KPIs, so on and so forth. But what about where the opportunity for change starts to emerge that's beyond that funding agreement, or actually it's for somebody else to be funded to do it, even though you're probably in the position to secure that funding? And I think Mark made this comment as well, that getting out of the way sometimes is the leadership quality you've got to exhibit, or saying, yeah, we will take on something, even though that's not within our direct scope, because I can see that X organisation or X community or X individual has the ability to cause a breakthrough, and what we've actually got to do is back them and find a way for that to occur. So I think that for me, I've seen it done really poorly, and then I've seen it done really, really well, and I'm trying to learn to do it really well in terms of what's the goal, and not to let a funding system get in the way, but use it, and of course meet the requirements you must, but how can you be more creative about that? Recently, we convened a reinvestment forum in Sydney, and it was really quite wonderful to watch representatives from the federal department and representatives from the same state department, who are both on a journey of trying to understand how you get money out the door to support place-based work, and each having very entrenched, strict finance department guidelines on how that can occur. And those pathways of getting funding out probably not being fit for this purpose. Watching them groan under the strain of recognizing, okay, I want to do this, we've got to do this, we've got to get it out in a more creative way, but I'm stuck. And I think Joe Taylor's question was to the point of, are we just going to revert to a single system and entrench it, and not seize the opportunity of a new government to find new ways of achieving outcomes? I'm quietly confident that at least with one of the departments I'm working with in Canberra, they're open to that and they're exploring new ways of working. Whether they'll ever get there is another thing altogether, but the fact that they're at the table and going, okay, I can see the reason this isn't working is because that's what community needs. And that's the mental model. That's the transformative change starting to just plant seeds. And I think that's at least a positive sign.
Belinda, I'd love to come to you on this one as someone who has spent so much time working to influence government from outside and now sitting within. You must be seeing these cultures everywhere now in a different light. What are you seeing in this context?
So yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, taking the place Geoffrey started, in terms of funding and, people, talking about who's best placed. And I mean, one of the realities is that, organisationally, as has already been pointed out, we all survive off those resources. And that's just like there's a practical reality of sort of pragmatics there. So, so getting beyond that, one of the things I think that's a real opportunity that still we're not hitting the mark on is to properly understand each other's perspectives. So, without sort of going into all of the detail, I've reflected a lot over the last 3 months since I've been working inside government, how I wished I properly knew some of the things I know now when I was working from the outside in, but also realising as I sit in my new role now that there's so much understanding to be built about what it means to work across a community service organisation. So I know that sounds a really obvious thing to say, but there's something about the form of collaboration, the form of relationship, that means we keep missing that opportunity to genuinely build understanding. And I think, Geoffrey, it goes to some of the comments that you're making about, who is best placed and playing to strengths. And there is no doubt, as I sit inside government now, that there are, obviously, some amazing enabling and other capabilities of government in policy and programming and investment that could be, amplified in an amazing way if we were able to genuinely bring the skills and capabilities and insights and knowledge of those outside government to play. So, one of the things I think is the best example of that, and I've done most of my work on this outside government, but is in commissioning. So, while I was in my role at CSI, Community Services Industry Alliance, we spend a lot of time working with community organisations to help them to build a perspective on commissioning that came at the task from their unique position. So not trying to think about how to tell government to commission better, but rather how to be better leaders in the system as commissioning occurs. And I still think there's a huge task to pursue in that across the sort of government community services space, to bring together, people across those systems in genuine partnership. And if we don't do that, if we don't sort of crack that nut, then that kind of whole pursuit of outcomes starts to become, really tenuous, because, what I would observe happens over and over again is that those sort of status quo established patterns of behaving, structures that help to inform that behaviour just become places that people revert to. It's comfortable, it's easy, it's what we know, it delivers us our annual budget, it delivers a set of, sort of political or other wins for government. And, so I still, and it probably comes to those earlier comments, it lies in relationship, it sits inside a rethinking or a reimagining, I guess, of what collaboration looks like. Maybe requires some brutal and truthful conversations, but that actually lift the veil on the motives and interests of either party across that divide. So really rethinking those relationships and building consensus, probably, which is, if you think about perhaps where we're at a Commonwealth level at the moment, all of those signs and signals about consensus-oriented relationships are there for the taking, aren't they? So, yeah, hope that's helpful. Tessa, thanks.
It's really interesting from each of you. We're starting to really unpack this idea that, Jane, you articulated as the difference between leading in a system and systems leadership. And I think we've heard already quite a lot about the need to collaborate and how. we've talked a lot about those kind of personal traits you might think about and capabilities in terms of vulnerability and recognizing the limits, as well as the kind of opportunities of what you can contribute. Really just want to continue to hear from each of you about what do you think these capabilities look like when you see that systems leadership? What do you recognise, so that we're really drawing on examples and kind of building this conversation about the difference between strong leadership and how we might think about that in an individual or an organisational sense, and what it takes at a systems level. And I guess while you're thinking about some of those capabilities and some of those examples, I mean, one of the things that we're pointing to in this conversation is that sometimes what an organisation is expected to deliver or is expected to be doing is at odds with what a system needs or the leadership that's needed within the system. Throw that open to any of you to start. Thanks, Jane.
I'm happy to pick it up. So one of the things I used to spend a lot of time thinking about the capabilities of the humility and curiosity, and that's absolutely the case. But I've been thinking more and more lately, it's about intentional leadership. So it's that ability to have a look at your system and to understand those very different perspectives and the things that are, pulling them in different directions. And then that ability to diagnose and say, what is the leadership that's required now in service of the system? And I think that's something that people who work systemically do all the time, is what's needed now. I've got this feedback loop. I've got this piece of data. I've had this conversation with this person. They're saying this. What leadership is required of me? Is it, as Geoffrey says, to get out of the way sometimes? Or is it for me to step in and to bring a collective together, or to build shared understanding and then take shared action? So I've been really thinking about that, and then how you do that, how you create those feedback loops so that our organisation just doesn't listen to the people it gets on with, but actually listens to the full diversity of experiences and brings that data and information in and works directly with beneficiaries. Yeah, so that's to kick us off.
I think the one I would add to this, and it's quite a strict one, is working in a systems change way requires expertise and capacity. So I think a criticism people often level at this way of working, which I think is wrong, is that it's a bit, soft and fluffy, or you've got a little bit of expertise in lots of different ways. And I think that's completely wrong, because the people I've observed who are really effective bring extremely serious capability. And why I think that's important is that if you're working to achieve change in a system that's currently not working for the change in the way you want it to, you've actually got to understand the system. And the one I'll point to again, and it's a really not cool or fun one, is funding. So if you've got a federal agency that wants to work differently but is really struggling because they're within strict parameters of the finance department, the most effective way in which you'll lead in a systems change fashion with that organisation is to understand their existing system and find the ways in which that really explicit structural change can occur through the policies, through the practices, through the way in which resources flow. Because if you don't have those skills in a really developed way, you're not going to speak the same language, and that's the language that's going to need to be used to transform, but you also are probably going to be dismissed as a lightweight. And so I think that's a really important, hard aspect to leadership in this space, which is, I'm not a criminal lawyer by background, so I've had to really spend time and effort to build up the skills of understanding the criminal justice system, because that's the system we're trying to change. It's one of the systems we're trying to change. So I think capability and expertise is an important one that often isn't focused on.
So one of the things that raises then is when the work that you're doing challenges your values. And, Geoffrey, you started by talking about an agenda around criminal justice, and particularly around incarceration or pathways into the criminal justice system for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And you really called out that kind of difference between working for abolition and working for change. And I think just in that example alone, let alone so many others that people in this conversation are working with, there's a lot there that can push us sometimes to pretty pointy ends of our own values or our own, how we hold our integrity. Really interested in hearing from you all about whether there's a duality that's required or how you navigate some of that in your work.
I'm happy to have a go at that, Tessa. I mean, absolutely. There's, I mean, maybe adaptability, flexibility. They might be all weasel words for duality. I don't know, but absolutely necessary. Like I've reflected a lot across the course of my career, and in terms of, you know, being involved in trying to make change, particularly systems change, and, you know, being on the inside and the outside of that. You know, I would kind of assess that over the course of my working life, I've travelled more and more to the centre. You know, I started, you know, my time spent in social impact investment, really working from the outside in. There's no doubt that that's what that space is all about, and particularly in some of the more pioneering work, really effectively taking the challenge up to the sort of financial system in a way, you know, to where I am now, which is really much more about working from the centre, working from the inside back out. And, you know, it's I find a constant and necessarily conscious thing to keep on reflecting on values and purpose at an individual level, and the attachment, association, connection between that and the organisation, or part of an organisation that I'm currently in, and its role in broader systems change, if even it sees itself as having that role. And really a set of choices almost on a daily basis about, you know, what to go in pursuit of, what to, you know, leave, go by. And I guess, you know, just reflecting on the examples before, you know, and thinking again about collaboration, you know, in the area that I'm working in at the moment, one of the areas we have responsibility for is in community recovery following disasters. And, you know, as everybody is absolutely aware of across the Eastern Seaboard, you know, the experience of concurrent and overlapping disasters now is so significant in people's lives. And, you know, people are impacted by that in ways that, you know, even 12 months ago they would never have imagined. And that, for the foreseeable future anyway, is the sort of set of challenges we're going to have to face. And I think in that context, there's absolute burning platform for the rapid transformation across systems, because it's just necessary. It's just unavoidably necessary. So we've been thinking about, from the perspective of our role in that, in community recovery, how to try to approach the task of that in a much more systems-oriented, networked way. And so that immediately starts to make you rethink about the way that you invest money, the way that you operate in the relationships that you have with external providers, the nature of those relationships in the context of, you know, wanting a partnership but having to meet, say, probity requirements in terms of funding, but also then, you know, thinking about how do you govern all of that? How do you effectively, collectively make decisions in a way that actually means that you do the best by the people that you serve and maintain, you know, appropriate governance around it. So for me, that's a really good example where there's a burning platform, unavoidable change necessary in the way the systems work to respond, but it's emergent. And so, you know, I think, again, that sort of, you know, that sort of challenge really of both leadership and adaptation in your own leadership to be able to see those opportunities and build on that emergence. And I think, Jane, to use your word, in an intentional way that, you know, that really takes people on that journey. And I think that space of emergency response is is so it's so compelling. It leaves us with no choice but to go there, really.
Thanks, Belinda. And you've connected directly with the number of things that have come through in the chat. So we've certainly got people joining us live who are engaged in systems leadership around climate crisis and both the responsive and the adaptive work that requires. And having just spent some time in the West, I just also need to include our colleagues in the West as well as what's happening on the East Coast, that absolutely we're actually seeing this as a national and obviously an international crisis that's affecting so many communities in so many ways. Keen to hear from others. Geoffrey, Jane?
I think we're starting to head down this discussion of the role of an intermediary here for me, because we as an organisation talk about ourselves as an intermediary, and obviously Belinda currently occupies the space towards the centre, and I think it's a really important way of describing that. And then there are others further out, well on the periphery. And one of the first things that struck me when I arrived at Just Reinvest was we as an organisation talk about not being protesters or abolitionists, but we work with a lot of people who that is the way in which they work, and that acknowledging your position and being really clear and understanding it, but then also understanding what the other is and what their position is, but then the space between it. And I think one of the qualities of good leadership in this space is being comfortable occupying an uncertain ground together. So there are lots of worldviews, perspectives, approaches to leadership I now interact with on a daily basis that I've never had to before. Because when you sit inside a law firm or inside a courtroom, we're all kind of in it for the same, we're heading in the same direction, albeit pursuing different outcomes. Whereas there are times where there are organisations working in partnership with us who have a very different approach to working, who probably even want to see different outcomes. But that's okay. And trying to show up, and we talk about how do we turn up in community, how do we turn up in a working group or in partnership, showing up in an open-minded way that assumes, okay, there is a good reason that individual or that organisation is approaching this problem in that way, and I'm going to try and understand it. And that's the way I try to approach even the people I know I have a similar worldview or way of working, trying to really unpack why they're going about problem solving the way they are, but then particularly the organisations or individuals who have a very different worldview or are coming from a different position. So if they're in the centre, what are the policies, what are the structures, what are the power dynamics, what are the ways of thinking that are causing them to show up the way they are? And then am I making it clear and really being obvious why I'm showing up the way I am? Because that'll allow us to build common ground and really occupy that middle space, which is where the change will occur.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Jane, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I do. There's so many things in that, Geoffrey, to unpack. It'd be good to really, in a minute, Tessa, go into the role of the intermediary. And can I just pick up two things? One that came up in the chat was that I think it was Gemma or someone said, we're not talking about purpose of systems. And I do think one of the things an intermediary can do is bring people together to make sense of what a purpose of a system is, because actually it can be quite different for different, there might be different objectives at play, and sometimes systems don't deliver what they're supposed to. And a good example is in early childhood education and care, people often articulate one of three purposes or objectives for that system: outcomes for children, so development, learning, educational outcomes for children, workforce participation, and equity. And if you dial up, for example, workforce participation and forget the other two, then you scale a system that isn't actually going to generate outcomes for children very much, because that's not its purpose. If you dial up outcomes for children, you may forget the children who are not able to access that system. And so I think part of the role of systems work is being able to help people hold multiple objectives of systems at the same time. And that's quite hard. Before we get to the intermediaries, I absolutely agree with Geoffrey's description there of helping people come into relationship where they have different ways of working and understanding the sort of drivers on them. I think it's hard too. I think we have to acknowledge that. I've had some really uncomfortable conversations where calling out unhelpful dynamics is actually challenging. And I think, you know, I've been reflecting on this. I had a circumstance last week where I met with an organisation that's a private consulting company, and they were putting out their views around what's happening in early learning. And in that, they presented to some of us. So there's 2 women on my team, 3 women, 1 man on their team. The man presented the whole time, even though the 3 women were deep experts in early learning, 2 of them with PhDs, proceeded to tell me everything about the system that I've been working with for 6 years now. And in that moment, at the end, there's no issue with the capture of the issues or anything like that, but I named what was happening in that, you know, in the sense that they were stepping into a really gendered experience for a start, but also that experience that often happens in social issues where external people come in and they tell you everything that is wrong with your system, right? Or the system you're working with, and don't appreciate the expertise that might sit around the table. That was hard to do, to call that out, and really shocked the organisation. And so I had to hold an uncomfortable space at the same time, holding that feeling that when you're working systemically and you're always trying to build bridges and always trying to understand other people's experiences, the naming pulls that into tension. And I think it's just important that it's not easy work at the same time. And I know Geoffrey has named those things previously before. Yeah.
And there's so much there about the personal in the professional. There's so much there, whether it's the kind of gender dynamics encountered for some, whether it's, you know, it's stigma and all sorts of unstated assumptions for others, you know, the role of institutional racism often in who is at the table, in who is enabled to speak and empowered to speak. But there's a lot there where you're talking about this kind of straddling of different spaces, and really kind of pushing us to think about the nuance of capabilities. And so I want to use that to move into, we will come back to the conversation about intermediaries, but I want to spend a bit of time thinking then around when is collaboration necessary? What is the leadership to enable collaboration? And when sometimes is that limited? When sometimes are we thinking actually about different ways of working that don't assume or don't only centre collaborative approaches? Because I think some of what I'm thinking about as you're talking about that example, Jane, is as you say, the space to challenge and potentially to resist, but at least to call out behaviours that you're not wanting to collaborate with. Belinda, would love to throw to you first on this question about when do you see collaborative leadership as being necessary, and what does it look like?
You make me think, Tessa, of an article. When I started in my role at CSIA, you know, about sort of 9 years ago, one of the challenges that was kind of put in terms of the establishment of that organisation was to try and break down all of the competition and silos that existed between community organisations and move towards a space where you know, organisations were genuinely working in the collective. Now, I'm not trying to conflate collective and collaborative, but working in the collective for, you know, common benefit, and using collaboration, I guess, is one of the ways of getting there. And I read an article, I think it was in the Harvard Business Review, I might have that wrong, but if you Google it, I'm sure it will come up, called Collaboration is the New Competition. Now, when you read the article, it's actually essentially an article on collective impact. But I just was really captured by the headline, right? What does it actually mean if collaboration is the new competition? And so there's lots of ways of thinking about that, isn't there? Because you could interpret that statement as, you know, competition is the way organisations and people in those organisations get what they want. So, you know, perhaps a cynical view of that headline is that you could use collaboration as a way of still getting what you want. And unfortunately, I think in some instances, examples across the community services space and also sometimes in how government uses collaboration, it is to that end. It's just a new version of people still getting what they want, individually or organisationally. So for me, you know, through the journey of that work and still now, I really kind of come back to that comment that I made before about consensus building. And I see a few comments along the way about, you know, being adept at negotiation and, you know, all of the discussion we've had so far about naming the stuff that's hard to name and engaging in, you know, really genuine conversations that have authenticity. You know, I think collaboration is actually always important, even if it's sometimes at the micro and sometimes at the macro. Indeed, humans are by nature highly social, you know, in our ways. We do everything through relationships. So, you know, I mean, I guess reflecting that, in fact, we've, you know, with collaboration made it something external to us when actually it's integral to how we work anyway. But then really starting to kind of push the boundaries of that to collective benefit. And I guess, you know, one of the things I reflect on often is, you know, Australian society, you know, some of this good, some of it bad, in our, you know, colonial context, has a history of mutuality, mutual benefit, cooperative organisations. You know, they all have in their DNA this orientation to collective benefit and collaboration. So, you know, I think that, you know, my answer to the question specifically is collaboration is always important. It's always, though, incredibly important to have your eye to as a leader, whose motivations are driving that collaboration, why are they driving it, for whom is it set up to benefit. Is it really about, you know, pursuing collective goals? Have they even ever been established? And again, you know, just to finish off, I picked up as well in the chat along the way there, the, you know, comments about actual methods of supporting collaboration, like partnership brokerage. And I think that can't also be underestimated. We talk collaboration, but we often do it without a decent set of techniques and skills at our disposal to be able to pursue it to its proper ends. So, you know, yeah, I think, you know, collaboration should be the new competition, but it should be done, you know, with a proper and thorough interrogation of motivations, purpose and outcomes, and shouldn't just simply be a new way of people getting what they want.
It's such an important call that you're all making here about the skills and the capabilities to collaborate, that we need to recognise them, that we need to invest in them. And certainly in our work at Health Justice Australia, we often think about that investment in terms of resourcing through funding or through dollars, but also resourcing the time and the relationship building. At the same time, as an organisation whose purpose is to support partnerships, the first conversation we're often having is, don't assume that every problem needs a partnership to solve it. And sometimes the permission to recognise that, the permission to put to one side those pretty tightly held expectations about partnership, is actually what opens up the space to find shared purpose. And so what I really want to kind of bridge, as we hear from others in this discussion, is to think broadly about what collaboration can look like, and how do we create the space, even if we're pursuing collaborative agendas, the space to allow that to be emergent, to think about different ways of collaborating, and really, again, to centre purpose, not only purpose of a system, but to make sure that we're not losing sight of that. Is that what's coming up for others in this question around when is collaborative leadership necessary and what does it look like?
No, you go, Jane. You go.
No, I'm happy for you to go. I'll follow.
Geoffrey.
I was just going to say that I think I completely agree with all of this, and sometimes that's operationalized by not being afraid to have a light touch, where collaboration doesn't mean, you know, equal shares of control or influence, or there are so many people working across so many systems trying to affect change. And particularly when I arrived at Just Reinvest, we were everywhere. And in fact, it's fine to be focused, and you may actually have much better impact if you're using your resources, and we all work in really finite environments when it comes to resources, both people and financial and time, using those resources in a targeted way, because you're best supporting purpose when you're having impact and effect. And I think when we talk about deep collaboration here, and it's about community leadership, we are an Aboriginal and a non-Aboriginal organisation. We've got a mixed board, we've got mixed staff, but we are partnered with Aboriginal communities. And so trying to understand what our role is and to sometimes have that light touch, because actually the biggest impact is going to be had when we sit back and play a supporting role and don't try and have a centre stage influencing, kind of presence. And that's really hard, particularly if you come at a problem thinking you've got an answer. And you're sitting there and you feel like your partners are circling around and missing the point. And I'm a really impatient person, so it's a big challenge I face. But actually, when you sit back and let the right players or the right people, and in our space, that's often the community, find the answer, it's going to have much stronger impact and lasting impact.
Yeah, so mine builds beautifully on what you were saying, Geoffrey. What we experience is we take up roles and create different initiatives according to what needs to be nudged in the system. So we convene and catalyse the APRI, which is different leaders and people across the early learning system from all different levels. Some of them are educators and teachers, and some are CEOs and all the rest of it, to come together to create a shared understanding of the early learning system, and then to take action collectively. And in that way, we are the fuel catalyst, if you like. We're building their capability to understand systems, to take action, and so on. That's really different from our role putting in a programmatic response to something, because we know it's a gap in the system that no one's meeting, and we may partner with people to do that, but in that way, we're the actor in the system. And so we do that, for example, when we're building, upskilling, building capability of educators to become teachers. And create impact there. And so collaboration, it depends what you're trying to solve and nudge for in the system. And they're not an either or, they're an and within a systems thinking. Yeah, so that's what was coming up for me, Tessa.
Thanks, Jane. And that really starts to get to a question that we've had from a live participant, which is an invitation to hear from the panel how you define or describe system collaboration. And I think part of what you're coming to there, Jane gets to that. Does anyone else want to respond? How do you define or describe system collaboration?
I think it's very different for every individual and organisation, given the context and the system change they're trying to achieve. So I've just talked about how we as an organisation work in a community-led way, that it's occupying a deep collaboration between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. That carries with it a set of kind of principles that inform the way in which we collaborate. And that's not necessarily going to be the same set of principles that might operate in, say, the space Jane works in, or the space that Belinda occupies now or has previously. And so I think, again, being really taking the time to understand, I think somebody said this in the chat as well, if you're developing a theory of change together with your partners and trying to settle on agreed principles for the problem you're approaching, that's going to set you up for the most success, because you'll have clarity, but you'll also understand the individual circumstance. The first day I arrived here, we went into a 4-day big partnership kind of theory of change development workshop with our funders, with the government agency that we're trying to change, with community members and us as an organisation. At first I thought that was just absurd, but now I see why that time was so necessary, because it informs the way we work throughout the year. And we constantly have to remind ourselves, all right, let's go back to see what we agreed on. And is that still right? And if it's not, that's okay. Do we need to revise it? But it's all about understanding and having clarity on principles of your partnership for the particular purpose you're pursuing. And that was a lot of P's in one sentence, so I apologize.
Tessa, I just wanted to add too, it's in the same vein as both comments, but one of the things I reflected a lot on in my time working across the community services space most recently was, that I guess the power of leaders in those organisations taking up the task of change themselves. So, you know, this sort of traditional form of, you know, an industry body or a peak body is as advocate to the system, you know, sort of trying to insert itself and make a claim, I guess, you know, to change. And look, you know, it's very easy, I think, for those systems to, you know, kind of nod politely or otherwise in accepting that information and then do nothing. And so one of the things that we focused a lot of our attention on was this idea of if these organisations individually, but more powerfully collectively, could reshape the way that they operate in the system within the limits of their power, then that would force others to start to at least feel uncomfortable, but maybe recalibrate. So, you know, as simple as coming to the table with a set of, you know, really well thought through, robust solutions to problems, rather than only coming to the table with the problems. So, you know, that sounds sort of very basic and very simple, but, you know, really interested in that idea of actually trying to, you know, I guess shift a little bit of the power away from that central space to the edges and support the edges to reshape themselves that, you know, in some ways force the hand of the centre, if you like.
That reminds me of really great advice I once got from a minister when I was advocating really hard for something, as you know, it was my job in that meeting. And the minister said, we're never going to do that, but you advocating that helps set the perimeters within which the policy debate is able to evolve. And just that clarity about the different purposes that we might serve and the space to share that. I think that really picks up the comments, Geoffrey, from you and also from Jane earlier, in terms of thinking about those different ways to work collaboratively and the different forms of leadership at different points in time that are needed. So just now a moment to re-engage with our fabulous audience who've been really interested in connecting via the chat. As we've been speaking, so too has the chat. We're going to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions. So we've been capturing some questions that are coming through. Invitation to our audience to think about your questions, and you'll have an opportunity to ask those directly, or by all means, please put them into the chat. While we warm up our audience for some of those opportunities, I do want to come back now to this question about intermediaries, which Geoffrey and Jane have both spoken about. And so, Jane, if we can start with you, tell us about the role of intermediaries in systemic change.
Yeah, thanks, Tessa. So system intermediaries are organisations that understand the whole system or seek to understand the whole system, and they work with all actors in the system. And when we say actors, we're talking about individuals and organisations. And they build capability around responding systemically, amplify efforts and sort of scale initiatives and innovations. Often people talk about, or there's been writing about, sort of 4 types of intermediaries. The role of a field catalyst, which does exactly those things I was talking about before, influencing, deploying capability where it's needed and so on. Capability specialists, and I know we've got some on the line who really develop and enhance capabilities. Another role of an intermediary is often that evidence to action. So research and evidence to policy work or to practice work, helping, you know, practitioners learn and kind of get better outcomes in their systems. And then you've got place-based organisations that are also intermediaries. What we found, there's a sort of group of intermediaries who meet and make sense of our work, is that often we move through all of those at different times, depending on what is needed in a system. And that defining too tightly is actually goes against working systemically, where you do need to make calls around what's needed and what's the role of an intermediary at this time. So just to go back to my previous example, the Front Project takes up the role of a field catalyst. And so we, you know, develop shared understanding of the system, build capability to respond. We influence, so we do policy work and we work with lots of people in the sector to understand how they can influence policy and so on. And we do research as well and evaluation. But we also know we're an actor in the system, and we hold those two roles. And they come in conflict at times, and sometimes there's a real tension between those roles. But we also do develop programmatic responses where we see needs, or we do undertake an advocacy position if, for example, no one else in the field is taking it up. You know, one of the really important things to call out in Australia now is we've got expansion and rollout of 3-year-old and 4-year-old kinder, which is fabulous in terms of moving everyone to 2 years before school. But what we've got is provision that's different across jurisdictions now. And that could potentially cement inequity. And so you still need to be able to call out things when sometimes other actors can't, because they're delivering services. So Tessa, that's just in a nutshell, intermediary. But I did want to name that most intermediaries do actually play two roles, both actor and sort of field catalyst. Yeah.
Geoffrey, what's your experience of that role as intermediary and knowing the space that you occupy within a system, even as you're working to change it?
So we as an organisation are quite interesting. Listening to Jane talk to the categories, I completely agree. You do kind of take different hats, but we're also divided between being a community-led organisation that has sites, has communities. So we've got teams that sit in their community and are affecting change, are identifying what we call justice circuit breakers, but they're basically systemic change that needs to occur. And it's arbitrary most of the time to say, well, that's just about place-based work, and then the supporting body here in Redfern works at the systemic level. It flows back and forth. And we always, when I arrived here, there was this talk about, well, we don't do programs, we don't do projects. And I said, well, let's look at last year's budget. Of course we do. There's 12 programs on that budget list, and that's okay. Intermediaries take different shapes to solve different problems. And there are times where we're leaning on our advocacy muscle, but there are times where we're absolutely plugging a gap. And it makes me think back to something you just said before, Tess. We have conversations with decision makers or with interest groups or with players in this space that others cannot. And that's because there's a perception, and you've got to actively maintain this perception that you sit in this space between, and that common purpose is what's driving kind of the bridging exercise. So in the space of raising the age of criminal responsibility, very early on, because of relationships with the decision maker here in our state, we could meet with them, really understand what the sticking point was, and have them articulate two really clear pieces of information that was stopping them from moving on this issue. And one of them, interestingly, was, and I think this is a pitfall in systems change work, there was a call for the change of a system, but there was no proposal for what was going to plug the gap afterwards. So in the state of New South Wales, it's quite a small number of young people that do come into custody under the age of 14 each year. It's a number that you actually could offer up a bunch of alternatives if you were to shift the policy. That piece hadn't been done yet. So to be able to bring that back to a larger network, a larger partnership group, and say, okay, this is one of the blockages for the attorney in making a decision. Let us as a group figure out who's best placed to develop some ideas so we can just remove that blockage. So I do think there is often a link between being an intermediary and helping to identify blockages, and then help to bring together the groups that will remove it as well.
Thanks. So we're going to move now. This conversation has really led to some questions coming through in the chat, so I'm going to start feeding those in. Invitation again to our online audience. By all means, feed your question into the chat, raise your hand, or let me know if you want me to come to you directly. And we'd love to start hearing what you're sitting with as you're listening to this conversation. But a question that's come through that I think connects really nicely with what we just heard from both Geoffrey and Jane. And the question is, how do you, as a system leader, how do you help key stakeholders move from reactively creating solutions to current issues and helping step back and look at the system and think about what might be the larger scale change that needs to be identified and then worked on?
I can pick that up first. I agree. I think it's one of the really valuable things that intermediaries can do. So I mentioned the APRI before, the one we convene of different system leaders. There's 30 odd of them. Every year we take between 10 and 12 more. And what we do is create the space for them to make sense of the system they're working in, and then for them to identify what might be the high leverage points in that system. I can't underscore how important it is in that process to build trust and safety, because there are often people who outside of that space may be advocating for totally different things. And so because we had, you know, a few people comment about the structure of our systems being market-based, competitive, don't set up those spaces. So you have to intentionally create them and bring people into them, and build the safety and trust to work together on issues. So that's how we do it. And really, for us, our sort of theory of change is by doing that, we will be able to work collectively on initiatives that will benefit children at the end of the day. And that's the orientation, is how will we decrease the vulnerability and the disadvantage that children experience in that system. Yeah.
Just building on that, Tessa, one of the things I'd reflect on in, you know, this is, you know, really challenging, because I think, you know, even as you're describing, Jane, you know, that sort of safe space and trust, which I agree wholeheartedly is so critically important. You have to accept as well that outside that room, those, you know, spaces, as you say, people are doing different, sometimes contradictory, sometimes have other alliances in other spaces. So I think it's that, you know, being prepared to sort of sit in the discomfort of that you can't drive homogeneity. It's not that collaboration, that you know, coming together is not about making it all homogenous and neat. And you have to accept, you know, that there's frayed edges or differences or whatever, but not let that deter you from a focus of building that trust or those relationships or driving at that purpose. So I think it's really great point.
I think I'd say that it's exactly that. It's about creating the space. But then someone in the chat, I think it was Joe Taylor, actually said, oh, well, what's the role of funders in all of this? I mean, we're really lucky that we have a couple of funding partners that understand the need for that space, because that space is people, is time, is resourcing. And so while we've got community teams who are always, by just the nature of the business model, reacting to what's occurred in Burke, for example, the night before or the day before, community comes together in the morning, police, the school, the elders, tries to work through what's going on. That's a crisis model. But building in time and space to support those community teams to step out of the day-to-day crisis and into this space is important. And we've got funders, you know, I've called out the Düsseldorf Forum already, who talk about ways you can do that untied funding, or, you know, funding programs, individuals, but creating space in the program delivery for the thought that's required. That's really, really important. That's, I think, a lot more difficult for government to do. But I think as we start to work in partnerships where we have government, philanthropy, and intermediaries sitting at the table, you're seeing government start to understand that this is not an unproductive way to work, that in fact it's extremely productive. And I think in one way that demonstrates the leadership and the vital role of philanthropy in helping this change to occur.
Thanks all. We do have questions coming in. I want to invite our online audience to continue contributing your questions and letting me know if you want to ask them directly. But I want to stay with this part of the conversation just for another moment, and to just give us some space to think about what's needed to enable these ways of working. And so I think we've talked a lot really about the capabilities. We've talked a lot about the relationships. We've talked a lot about that space to step in and step out. Just want to give the panel space to think about, is there anything else in the conditions that are needed? And Geoffrey, can't help but notice you talked about being lucky to have funding that enables you to work in that way. And I think there's something really implicit there that is not yet the norm. And yet so many of the issues that everyone is grappling with require these kinds of responses. So moment to hear from our panel, anything else about what's needed to really enable these ways of working?
So yeah, I'd add, you know, this is going to sound very government as I say it, but an authorising environment. And, you know, going back to the example that I gave before, that could be, or to what Jane was talking about before, any of the examples we talked about, that could be, you know, creating that authorising environment inside a partnership or collaboration or a set of relationships, but being explicit about where that authority comes from. You know, I think it's a step we miss so often as we pull people together and we get involved in, you know, collaboration. And I know as we were, you know, working to bring community organisations together, it was a step we missed often, was to actually ask that question, when we decide to go and act together, whose authority are we drawing on? And what that often called into play in that setting was that we were often working with senior leaders, CEOs, but actually what they then needed to do was to go back and do a whole heap of checking inside their organisations at a governance level and bring that authority collectively, you know, kind of back to the table. And so we got better and better at actually asking that question with, you know, as we go to act, on whose authority is that? And sometimes a simple answer to that was the authority of CSIA itself. But just being clear, crisp about that became more and more important as we did that collective work.
Tessa, one thing I think Belinda highlights is that importance of the feedback loops. I think one of the conditions that needs to be in place is, or couples centering those who experience the systems and ensuring they're part of decision making and they're part of the work of an intermediary or a collective effort. Instead, you know, and then having the feedback loops for when systems aren't delivering intended purpose or aren't, things are not quite working. And I think developing the capability to have those feedback loops that are done intentionally, without sort of blame and criticism, but with curiosity, I think all those are important conditions as well, which is slightly different from the funding piece, which I totally agree with. Because if you can't do this kind of work, you can't nudge systems. Yeah.
And I guess from our point of view, part of that is the importance of data and evidence and evaluation. So core to the way we work, both as a, you know, what we describe as a central body or a supporting body, but also in our site teams, is the primacy of the MEL framework. What are you monitoring and how are you evaluating it? Having an agreed framework, but then the L is the biggest part for me. What's the learning? And being really comfortable with the fact that it's a moving piece. You can't, to go back to the authority piece, I think that is huge. And in our space, it's particularly onerous because we know the significance of who speaks for country, who in a community has the authority. Just recently in Moree, having a meeting, new mayor, resetting the LGA relationship, says we really want a group that we can go to and know that that is the community speaking to us. Great aspiration, nearly impossible to achieve. So having to go through that conversation of, well, we're never going to offer that to you, but we've set a framework about how do you achieve a level that you're comfortable. And I think somebody earlier spoke about risk. What's the risk appetite that you accept? The voice that's going to come out of this group can speak on a range of topics to a degree, and you've got to then, you know, co-design or partnership is about accepting when you'll step into that risk space and make a decision. So figuring out those really complicated conversations and frameworks and arrangements isn't easy, but that's where this great community-led, data-driven systems change occurs, but it's really hard.
Geoffrey, that's a beautiful segue to a question from our audience about the frameworks that anyone might be using. So you've given us a really clear example of a framework around evaluation through a monitoring, evaluating and learning framework. Can we just hear quickly from the panel, and then I'm going to come to the last question, whether there are any other frameworks that you're using or formal systems to guide your systems work?
Sorry, Belinda, did you want to go? Yeah, so we have a monitoring, evaluation, learning framework as well, and within that we have different methodologies we use, such as SIPSES, So significant instances of, policy or system impact and so on. We also, in not frameworks, but ways of working, use things around adaptive leadership in this space as well. So drawing on systems leadership, adaptive leadership, all those kinds of ways or practices of working as well. And very happy to share our MEL framework to anyone as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Jane. Belinda.
So similarly, and Jane's already mentioned this, but the discipline of developing theory of change for, either sort of small pieces or larger pieces, I just think such a fantastic tool, have used that a lot. And, similarly, built out evaluation frameworks off, theory of change that support a kind of ongoing learning culture. But the other thing I've got to use a lot over the course of the last number of years, which I think, Jane, goes to a point you made earlier about bringing the voice of people with lived experience to the centre of the conversation, is the most significant change method. And it's just such a beautiful, straightforward way of, continuously involving the voice of people in the work that you're doing. Not the only way, of course, I acknowledge that there are plenty of other ways as well. But yeah, so there are a couple of things that I've used quite a bit.
Thanks, Belinda. Geoffrey.
The only formal framework I'd call out that we use across the organisation is deep collaboration, particularly that sort of platform C approach, the 5 fundamentals. And I think that's particularly useful if you're working in the space of Aboriginal and First Nations people working alongside non-Aboriginal entities as well. It's a really great framework to understand how, I think it was Belinda talked about this earlier, occupying that space of tension, but how you make that a productive space.
Thanks all. I'm going to draw the panel discussion to a close. There were really fabulous comments and questions that we haven't been able to get to, and one really important one that I'm going to use as a conclusion rather than a question is to think about the well-being of leaders in this work, recognising that leadership happens at all levels of the system, not only in the people with leader in their title, but thinking about how hard the work is, thinking about those reflections from our panel and how important it is that we take care of ourselves and that we think about well-being as really critical to effectiveness and impact. With that, I'm going to speak on behalf of the audience and just thank each of you so much for your insights and contribution to this conversation today. Geoffrey Winters, Jane Hunt and Belinda Drew. And I'll hand back now to Mark Riboldi. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tessa. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So 3 of these people who I knew before the event, Geoffrey, Jane and Tessa, were 3 of my favourite people to talk and listen to. And I've now got a 4th one with Belinda. It's kind of a privilege of my job to be able to engage with and hear from interesting people. And I hope everyone in the audience has also enjoyed the conversation. Please join me however you can, whether it's through the chat, whether it's through an emoji, whether it's through raising your hands in the air like you just don't care, with thanking our participants today, particularly Tessa for facilitating such a fabulous discussion and keeping things flowing. Thank you from the Sydney Policy Lab for attending. Thank you for our partnerships. As I mentioned earlier, this is part of our Strengthening Australian Civil Society project, which is funded and supported by the Paul Ramsay Foundation. So thank you to them for their generous support. If you have time, please fill out our feedback form. We will send around the recording of this event, hopefully in the next few days. So, I mean, I know I need to go back and listen to some of these things because there's just so many great insights. So please pop yourself off mute and put your cameras on as you say goodbye. And yeah, thank you very much.